Good morning. Thank you to joining us on this morning's webinar. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and I'm very pleased to have with us today Kira Branch and Macy Moore from ODOT's Office of Transit, and they're going to be giving a 5310 operating invoice training via webinar. A couple of items before we get started. We do have a poll question for you, which I'm going to go ahead and launch now, and we'd ask that you please respond to that poll question. And that'll help our presenters determine how much information they're going to provide during the webinar today. So hopefully you can go ahead and take a second and vote. And while you're doing that, I would like to let you know that we are going to try to record the webinar. Hopefully that recording's successful. And if it is, then the recording will be made available for you to be able to watch in later times. If the webinar is not successful, then we'll probably be circling back around to our presenters for them to re-record so we can still have this information for you. During the presentation, we do ask that you please put your questions in the question pod. I know there's also a chat pod, but the question pod now allows us to capture your questions and provide responses, and also to be able to follow up with those after the webinar is completed with a Q&A document. So with that, it looks like we have 2 people out of the 3 that are online right now that have voted. Maybe the one person who just got on could also let us know what their answer is to that poll question, and then we'll be able to close the poll and move forward. But as it stands right now, Macy, you've got a 50-50 split. So,
okay. All right.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll then. That way we can move forward with your presentation.
Okay.
It's all yours, Macy.
All right. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today to go through this process for submitting your operating invoices for your 5310 grants. Victoria, just made me aware that some of you have actually never gone through this process before. So just to kind of set the expectations of what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to be discussing the actual Excel invoice that Kiera sent to you via email yesterday. You should have that template. It's also in the handouts section of this webinar if you need to go ahead and download that. We're going to be going through that invoice step by step, the different tabs, the information we're going to require from you, where you locate that information, kind of the process of requesting budget revisions, things like that. I will touch somewhat on the how you classify costs in certain line items, but if we require a lot of information on that, if you really want some more assistance on allowable costs and classifying those costs, we are open to that request, and we could set up additional training very specific to that part of the invoicing process. I'd want to bring in some more subject matter experts on that. But please feel free to record any questions you have relative to that. And at minimum, we could go ahead and get the responses and provide those in a Q&A document after the webinar if I'm not able to address it today. So additionally, Kiara provided you guys with a PDF that has instructions for this invoicing process. And this instructions document is basically going to follow the same outline as the webinar that I'm presenting today. It gives you step-by-step instructions of how to complete each tab, the information we are requesting from you, things like that. So if you're able to have this open while we're going through, it might be helpful, but if at minimum you can always reference this after the fact, and it should still give you pretty detailed information on what we're expecting where. So for the most part, I'm just going to be staying in the Excel document. I'm not going to bounce back and forth between the instructions and the Excel. But if at any point you guys have questions, please let us know, and Victoria will be assisting us with answering those in a timely manner. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and go into the actual Excel document itself and start to kind of walk through the different components and what we're requesting of you. So this is the Excel template that you should have received. You will complete this template at the beginning of your period of performance for your project, which for operating projects are January 1st through December 31st. So when you are interacting with this document, you're going to see some different color coding. So these tan cells here that you see, those represent fields in the document that you only need to complete one time at the beginning of the year. This is not a section of the invoice that will need to be updated quarterly. So this first project information tab is the tab that you will update first. So in this cell B1, you're going to want to enter your grantee name as it appears on your contract with ODOT for the project. We want to make sure that all of our associated project documentation is related directly back to the entity that we are contracting with. So if you have, if you are a sub recipient of another grantee, for example, your county government might have the contract with ODOT, but you are providing the service on their behalf. We want to see that county government's name here because that's who the contract's with. So that tends to be a point of confusion sometimes for people. So moving on to the next cell, this is the project number. And what we mean by that is the ODOT issue project number that you get. So where can you find this information? This information is going to be located in the contract that you receive from ODOT for your project. So some of you, this may be your first year in the program. You should have received your contract by now. If you haven't, please reach out to Kiera. But this contract has the information that you need in order to complete these fields of your invoice. So in this section here, which is your project data sheet, everyone's is going to look a little bit different. This table exists for each project that you were awarded from ODOT for calendar year 2020. So your project or your contract will have your operating project and any other projects that you were awarded. So it's important that you find the operating project within this project data sheet because that's the project information you're going to want to reference for this invoice process. So back to this invoice, this project number section here is going to relate to this ODOT fan code field on your contract. So a lot of cases, it's going to look like this. Something to this nature. I'm just putting in random numbers here for your reference. So it's going to look like that on your contract. And you should have something that says operating assistance here. And then your ALI code. That is the operating ALI code. So those two things there should tip you off that that is the project you are looking for. So this is, again, the cell that you're going to want to reference in order to complete this section of your invoice. So the next thing we're requesting here is the contract number. Again, this is found in your contract from ODOT. So I'm going to show you where to find that information. So that information is data field number 1 in the contract data sheet, which is the second page or the first page beyond the cover page of the contract. So cell 1 right there, that's going to be your ODOT contract number. It should look something like this, something like that is what you're looking for. So that information is going to be entered onto your invoice there. Then you're going to want to enter your total project cost, federal share, and local share information. So the information that we are completing so far in this project information tab is what's being populated and informing the rest of the tabs of this invoice template. So it's important that this information is accurate and input it in the beginning, so that way the whole form works as it's supposed to. So to make sure that you get the most accurate information and that you're putting the information in here that's going to match ODOT's records and ultimately our encumbrance from which we are dispersing your funds, again, you're going to want to reference your contract when setting this portion of your invoice up. So back down here in your project data sheet, back in the table that represents your operating project, you will find the total federal and local share amount that has been contracted with you for calendar year 2020. So, you should see amounts here, and I'm making stuff up here on the fly. And this is the information that you are going to want to make sure matches. Okay, so that information, I'm going to go ahead and update this Excel so that it all you guys can see now that we've gone through that, how I'm doing this. Right?
Macy, I just want to let you know there's no questions in the chat or in the question pod right now, but you're doing a great job with this presentation. And hopefully everybody who's on this call is going to be able to benefit from participating today. So if you do have questions, please put them in the question pod, and that way we can get you a response, and then also be able to include it in a Q&A document that we can send out afterwards. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Victoria. Yes, so fortunately, we are starting you off with the easiest part of the invoice, so kind of getting your confidence going. It might get a little bit more involved the more we go, but like Victoria said, please do not hesitate to ask questions. This is being recorded, so any questions you ask, someone viewing it in the future may have, so it may benefit them as well. So you are encouraged to ask those questions and make this as interactive as possible. It's not an ideal way to do training, but given the current circumstances, we are trying to do the best we can with making sure to keep you guys informed. Okay, so moving on in this project information tab of the invoice itself, we are going to go into the contract period covered. Okay, so again, I don't know if this is going to be shocking to you, but this is going to be in your contract. So it is, sorry, I guess I should have highlighted that. Right here, here's your start and end date for your period of performance. As I mentioned, all of our operating projects are for a duration of 1 calendar year. So you are not going to really find that there's going to be a circumstance where that is not going to be what you're going to put there. But just to verify it, make sure everything's going to match our records. I encourage you to reference your contract to make sure that this matches what we have on record for your project. So the contract period covered, again, is going to be that period of performance. And you're just going to come into the drop down here. It's going to be towards the bottom. And you're going to grab that date range that is represented in your contract. So this lets us know from this project information tab exactly for what duration you're going to be claiming expenses under this project. Okay, so federal assistance column here. What we're looking for here is what federal program is this invoice associated with? And so for you, the people on this call, it is going to be the 5310 program. And it's also your operating project. And so you're going to select that from the drop down. Once you do that, this federal grant ALI number is going to populate for you. And this is going to be important in the revenues tab later and how the reconciliation tab calculates your payment. And so making sure that that correct grant source is selected will be important for the function of the invoice later. So just double check that that represents what your project is. So these three fields here are populated and calculated fields. So you will not input any information here. Again, when you're interacting with this invoice, you are looking for tan fields, and then you'll see later blue fields. any field that is gray or white represents a populated or calculated field, and you do not need to do anything with that. So what this tab is going to show you once we're all the way through this process is essentially what ODOT's payment is to you for that quarter. What it's doing is calculating your expenses and your revenues. And so you're putting in your expenses in your expenses tab, it's going to pull that total over here to cell B11. When you're putting all your revenues in, it's going to pull that total over into B12, and then it's going to calculate that difference. And with the nature of these grants, because they're reimbursement, you're obviously going to have a discrepancy between your revenues and expenses until you receive your federal payment to essentially make you whole for your operating costs. And so your expenses and revenues by nature are not going to balance, and it's going to show the difference as that payment that ODOT must submit to you in order for your expenses and revenues to balance in the end. So when you see a number pop up here at the end, prior to submitting your invoice, and it's, this red number and it doesn't say 0, do not worry. This actually contradicts our instruction document. Our instruction document says it should say 0, but that needs to be updated. So do not worry about that, and we will get that instruction document updated to reflect the accurate procedure here. So we'll come back to this after we get some numbers entered so I can show you exactly what I'm referencing here. So that is it for the project information tab. So if you have any questions on this tab, feel free to ask it. I know it's pretty straightforward. If you think of anything later, don't hesitate to ask. But if there are none, and I'm hearing none.
There are none right now. I did want to mention for the people that joined a little later that in the handout pod, there are some handouts that you can download that were loaded in there for you. And if you do have questions, please just put them in the question pod. We're more than happy to read those off and have Macy respond to them for you.
Yes. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move to the revenues tab so that we can kind of walk through the process here and what you're going to need to do. Okay, so as you can see, it populated information into this tab for me based on what I entered in the project information tab. So again, that's why it's important to double check that information, make sure it's accurate, because it's essentially going to be a domino effect through the whole invoice if it is not. So it's going to pull my grantee name, my project number, and my federal share in for me. No additional effort required on your part. So this is where earlier I was referencing the tan versus blue cells.
Macy, got a question?
Okay, go ahead.
It's from Marcia, and she would like to know, where do you enter the state share?
Okay, so if you have received state share, you are going to put it in with local. For the invoicing process, we consider that to be non-federal. You are going to enter, that's why I'm talking about making your project totals balance. We don't have a separate state share line here, as you can see. Now, in terms of your revenues, that's where you're going to capture that separation. So we have state assistance here in your revenues where you can actually capture the state respective to your other local revenue streams. So in terms of actually having your project totals that populate through, include it with your local, because in that case, we consider it kind of a non-federal source, but in your actual invoice itself, capture it separately. Does that answer your question, Marcia?
Marcia's not responding right this second, but I'm sure she'll let us know if that
Okay.
answered her question. I said, yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay, so again, that earlier I had referenced the tan versus blue cells. So this is the first time in the document where you are going to come into a situation where you have both here. So as I mentioned before, tan represents fields that you only enter at the beginning of the invoicing process. These are not fields that you will have to change or update every quarter, unless something changes, which we'll talk about. The blue cells do represent fields that have to be updated every quarter. Okay, so you see cell, C through F, row 4, represents the report period covered. So this differs than the report period covered in the project information tab, because this is actually related to the period of time that covers the expenses and revenues that are included in this invoice submission. So what does that mean? So if you are submitting quarter 1 expenses to ODOT, then you are going to want to make sure that this date in this cell represents the period that was covered under quarter 1. So quarter 1 is January through March. Okay, so you're going to find that in the drop down, and we're obviously in calendar year 2020, so you're going to want to make sure that date represents the current year. And that is what you're going to enter here in that cell. This is important because when we are reviewing your invoice and we are approving it, the Division of Finance, which ultimately disperses your payment and has to have supporting documentation for that disbursement, must see the period for which that payment relates to. And so this part of the invoice, when we print it and we provide it as supporting documentation, verifies those dates that we're entering on the payment documentation. And so it's important that this is updated with each submission so that that is consistent and accurate. So just to kind of take it a step further to really kind of explain a little bit further, let's assume that you have now submitted quarter 1 and you're in quarter 2 and you're going to be submitting quarter 2. What do you do with this date? You are quarter 2 is obviously April to June. And so when you come into here, you are going to want to select January to June. So you notice that it's not going to say April to June. It's going to keep a year-to-date total because this invoice documentation still has that first quarter, those first quarter expenses and revenues on it. So the invoice supporting documentation still represents 2 quarters, even though a payment's been dispersed on the first one. We want to make sure that this report period kind of keeps a year-to-date record of the period that the expenses represented cover. So let me know if you guys have any questions on that and what we're asking from you here. I'm going to switch it back to quarter 1 because that's what I'm going to be focusing on in my demonstration. Are there any questions, Victoria?
There are not.
Okay, so I'm going to move on, but if you think of anything, don't hesitate to enter it into the question pod. Okay, so this section, this part of the invoice process has always caused a lot of confusion and questions. So I'm going to focus on this annual budget section and kind of explain what we are looking for here. So back during the original application process, ODOT requested your project budget from you, as well as a budget narrative that explained essentially how you came up with the estimates for each line item and what costs you intended to include on your invoice. And this was all a part of ODOT screening your project for eligibility for reimbursement. And so through that process, ODOT ultimately approved a budget for your project. And so what we're looking for here on this invoice is that you are basically recreating that approved budget in here. So if in your application project, you said, I have $30,000 of state GRF revenue, and I have, I'm going to get, $20,000 of 5310 mobility management, or sorry, not mobility management, operating assistance. And then, I have E&D fares and so on and so forth. Okay, you said this in your project budget. We want that to be the same information that is put into this invoice. some people have come into the invoice later and they've just assigned their approved project total, however they see fit at that time. And why we don't allow that to occur is because we have not vetted those expenses or that revenue. The application process is really our opportunity to make sure that you're using eligible local match sources with your revenue and that you are claiming eligible expenses. And so if we allow you to just come in here and put assigned project amounts in line items that we have not reviewed, we're really making ourselves vulnerable and you vulnerable to a situation where later we come in and perform an audit and we find that something didn't add up and now we're potentially in a payback situation. And so when you submit this first quarter invoice, the first thing we're gonna do is make sure that your annual budget on your revenues and your expenses matches the ODOT approved budget from the application process from which your project was originally awarded. So we've had people ask, well, we submitted that application budget 7 months ago and things have changed and we need to adapt our budget. That's totally fine. And we have a process for that. We just ask that you contact us if that happens to be the case so that we can perform that budget revision and make sure our records capture that local revenue stream and the expenses that are now associated with your project that were not previously reviewed. And so let's say you want to change your annual budget. All you have to do is contact Kiera via email and let her know my original budget was within this line item. I would like to move it to this line item. And for this reason, and these are the costs associated. It's essentially like a mini budget narrative from the application process. This way, Kiera knows and has on record the expenses that you intend to claim or the local match source that you intend to use to match the federal dollars. And there doesn't have to be any question about whether or not that was eligible. This is really important because we do not require you to submit receipts and verify your costs through this invoice process. We just don't have the resources in order to review an invoice at that level, especially when you're talking about, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants and expenses. And so because we do not require that level of verification prior to payment, we are really at the mercy of that detailed review in the beginning and the mutual understanding and agreement that you will not deviate from those agreed upon expenses and revenues without prior ODOT notification and approval. So we really rely on that budget revision process to make sure that we are not setting ourselves up or you up for a situation where upon a more detailed review, we find out that things were not done consistent with the requirements of the program. And now we're in a situation where those costs were eligible and you have to now pay ODOT back. We don't want that. You certainly don't want that. So that's the process we've put in place. So the annual budget field for revenues also exists on expenses. You can see here. And as I mentioned, it needs to match the ODOT approved budget that we awarded you through the application process. So when it comes to actually entering your revenues, you're just going to enter for that line item what your revenues were for that quarter. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I don't think many people are going to have questions on that. But let's just say you had increased revenue here beyond what you imagined, okay? And now you have a negative budget balance. Okay, so obviously in the FTA programs, you're not going to be able, you can't profit, right? We're only going to reimburse you the difference between your expenses and your revenues. And so if you report additional revenues on your expense or on your invoice above and beyond what you estimated, it's probably just going to result in a reduced operating payment from us. And as long as those revenues are consistent with the requirements for the local match source, there really is no issue here. It's just something to bear in mind that we do expect you, and it's a requirement of the uniform guidance that you do report all revenue associated with your transportation program and the grant. So you're not just going to report enough revenue to draw down your FTA grant. You could, but that again, when we audit you and if we find additional revenue that was not reported, we're going to have to relate that to the federal payments we made and determine if we overpaid federal dollars that you were not actually eligible for. So on this tab, you know, we're not as restrictive with you having more revenue than budgeted or anything like that. We would just probably verify that that revenue is consistent with the nature of the revenue that you described in your application. But it's just kind of a reminder that ultimately when we make your payment, it's only going to be the difference between your revenues and expenses. So if you're expecting, okay, my expenses were $100,000, that means I'm going to get $50,000 in federal money. You know, there's an added layer there of reconciliation we do, and we'll go into that in the operating reconciliation tab. But that was just something I wanted to point out here. But I think for the most part, this tab is pretty straightforward. You're just entering your revenues for that quarter, you know, and you know your revenues and things like that. But please ask any questions in the chat pod relative to this tab, and I'm happy to attempt to answer them to the best I can.
No additional questions yet. You
Yeah,
must be doing a great job here.
Oh, no questions. Okay.
No
So,
questions yet on
I
this
think,
part.
like I said, I think this tab is pretty straightforward. We rarely have issues on this tab. It's really related more to how you're establishing your annual budget. So I don't anticipate too many questions, but like I said, if you think of them later, please go ahead and ask them. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the expenses tab, moving right along here. So again, it's kind of with each tab, you see more information being populated. So now you can see in this top section, it requires no additional entry on your part. Everything has been populated at this point and informed by previous tabs. So you don't need to enter anything here. Obviously, the report period for your revenues for this particular invoice is going to be the same for your expenses, so no need to duplicate effort there on your part. So again, same situation here on the expenses as the revenues. You're going to want to enter the approved ODOT budget here on your annual budget for your expenses. So whatever you said, if you were going to claim vehicle operation salaries and you anticipated, you know, $100,000 here, or 10, $100,000, and since the time that you submitted your application, you had drivers quit or you added drivers or this number is going to significantly change, just go ahead and reach out to Kiera and let her know that you're going to require some type of modification to your budget. The thing to remember here is if you are going to be changing if you're going to be moving money from one line item to another, you still have to work within the constraints of your federal award. You know, there's not going to really be an opportunity for us to add additional federal after the award. And so if you need to take from one to add to another, you know, that's fine. But that will have to occur within your budget if that's the route you need to go. So it's just kind of something to remember that in order for this to go up, something must go down. So once that whole annual budget is updated, you're going to move into your quarter totals. And the same for the revenues. You're going to enter the total cost of that line item for the quarter. Excuse me. So, if you had $20,000 worth of expenses in quarter one for vehicle operations, you're just going to enter that high level total here. We don't, through this process, we don't have, a huge breakdown process where we're collecting timesheets and things like that. But a warning is, just because we do not request that information through the invoicing process itself, we will complete a technical assistance review on the 5310 providers who receive operating and/or capitalized maintenance. And during that technical assistance review, there is a financial review component. And during that process, we will be pulling those detailed records. We will be pulling all of that supporting documentation that you used to ultimately complete your invoice. And we will verify that all of that information is consistent with the totals that you have been entering into your invoice. And so that's kind of our process for ensuring eligibility during our reimbursement. It's kind of a two-part. One, during the application period, when you're doing your budget narrative and explaining your estimates, that's a super important part. But then on the follow-up through the technical assistance review and actually performing that detailed audit, essentially, of your program-related expenses. So I just want you guys to be aware of that and what we do with that. The other thing that we require, and this is going to, we can send additional information to those of you who have never done this process before. We do have a kind of a write-up on this. We require a project cost report. The project cost report is an ODOT term. I don't know of many cost accounting systems that have that report function in them. It's something that we have dubbed this documentation that we require. But essentially what the project cost report requirement is where at the end of the year with your fourth quarter invoice, you will submit something like your profit and loss statement, that kind of ledger that shows those balances in your cost accounting system so that we can compare them against the final invoice to make sure that everything reconciles. So, if your account system has different codes than what our invoice says, then that's where, you're going to have that crosswalk that shows this code for us is this code for you. These are the costs that we claimed here, and it's all going to match up. As a condition of this award, you guys did submit the 2 CFR 200 guidance documentation through the application process. So that's where all of that hard work and blood, sweat, and tears comes into play here. Through that process, we asked for that crosswalk of your accounting system to our ODOT program. And so, that's essentially where all of that work will be utilized in order to ensure that you have captured your costs consistently and accurately. We do this in the fourth quarter because we do it prior to final payment. That way, if there's anything that doesn't add up, you can still reconcile that in your system, resubmit, and make sure that that final payment we disperse is going to be eligible and accurate. So that's something that you should expect at the end of the year. And like I said, if you do not know what the PCR process is, Kiera can send that information out to you, and we can make sure that you understand what we're going to be requesting now. That way, if you need to make any modifications to your cost accounting system or processes in order to comply with that requirement, we can be proactive instead of reactive in the fourth quarter, unfortunately has been the case in some instances, and it's not a pretty process. So we want to make sure that we're setting you guys up to be successful now, and getting these payments processed and out the door quickly and timely. So, excuse me. So in terms of, I've had several questions, people ask questions on, where do I claim this type of expense? It's few and far between. I think for the most part, a lot of people know how to categorize their expenses on the invoice process. But I did kind of want to make you guys aware of some documents you can reference if you're in the position where you're trying to determine allowability. And you can always reach out to ODOT too. You can always reach out and ask specifics. When in doubt, always ask. We're happy to make that call on how to classify your document or your expenses in order to be compliant. But if you want to take a proactive approach and you want to research yourself, I want to make you aware of the Uniform System of Accounts document, also known as the USOA. So that document is on the FTA website. They also uploaded it into the handout section of the webinar, so you can download it from there as well. So one disclaimer is that in the federal fiscal year 2018, they did update the Uniform System of Accounts. I'm sorry, I'm telecommuting thanks to COVID-19, so my dogs are here with me. If you hear a rogue bark, I sincerely apologize. So they did update that document in federal fiscal year 18, and it's located in the same area on the FTA website. But the main difference between the two USOAs is essentially how they classified the codes and the line items. So on our Excel invoice, you see this 50101, and then you see these different numbers here. They've changed that classification in the new USOA. So our invoice template is not a one-to-one relation to the new USOA. We still have to go through that process of updating ours to reflect the new USOA. That's something we're going to be doing for calendar year 2021. So what we've provided to you is the USOA document that existed prior to the update that still references the same line item codes that we do, just so it's a little bit easier for you to attribute those costs and expenses. Materially, there wasn't really much change content-wise. So if you're referencing this other version of the USOA, you're not going to run into a situation where something that was eligible in this version was not carried forward to the new version. It's not going to be, a trap for you there. So anyways, this USOA really kind of speaks specifically to FTA programs. So the 2 CFR 200 uniform guidance that we oftentimes reference, that's more high level, Office of Budget Management requirements for all federal programs. And it's not super specific to FTA programs. And so the USOA kind of bridges that gap for you in understanding how they expect those program-related expenses to be classified. But the uniform guidance is really important for you to understand, for you to know, what is direct versus indirect costs. The USOA makes a lot of assumptions that you understand that foundational guidance, and then it kind of builds on it. So, one thing I wanted to touch on was things like administrative salaries, for someone who's like your executive director. If you're someone like a senior center or community action, or, an organization where transportation is just one component of what you do, then you might have certain staff members who are also involved in your residential program or other programs non-transportation related, and only a portion of their time is spent in transportation. So while the USOA will tell you, okay, so for individuals who work on this part of the transportation program will be claimed here, it doesn't tell you, oh, but make sure that you have an approved cost allocation plan, right? So that's where the uniform guidance comes in. That's where R2 CFR 200 guidance documentation process comes in, is really making sure that you have everything in place prior to this point to make sure that those costs you're going to be claiming are eligible. So, that's just a word of caution to you. I am bringing up the USOA as kind of explaining the FTA related program costs. I'm just going to search here. Okay, cool. way to cooperate with me. It kind of gives you like different expense functions and things like that, that you kind of know at a high level how they classify vehicle operations and all revenue vehicle operations and things like that. So then you can go to that section and know, okay, so for example, transportation administration and support under vehicle operations. It gives you a summary of what those activities include. And then it kind of gives you all of those different line items, operator salaries and wages, fringe benefits, management service fees, which all relate back to our invoice here. Operator salaries and wages, other salaries and wages, spends benefits. It's a one-to-one there. And you can kind of see how they say, what they say can be claimed there. So for people who do these component activities, this is how you would classify their contributions to the project. So I find the USOA really helpful. Oftentimes I'm referencing it when I get those specific questions about how to classify costs from subrecipients. And so I wanted to make you aware of this document so that you could reference it if you were kind of in a pinch and wanted to make a determination. But I wanted to kind of caution you on what the USOA really is, and that it doesn't replace the uniform guidance, and that the super circular and all those requirements of allocating costs and things like that. So just, if you're in doubt about that, and if you have the right things in place in order to claim certain things, please reach out and we can work with our Office of External Audits and make sure you're set up and ready to go, and that there's not going to be any issues during that technical assistance review when we're performing that more detailed review of how you claimed costs. But, in the beginning when I was talking about the nature of this webinar and what we're going to be discussing, I mentioned this kind of component of the invoicing process. And if you really want an in-depth training on any of that, it's kind of outside the scope of this webinar, but I'm happy to coordinate that with Office of External Audits and other individuals who represent our main point of contact in that process as well. So if that's something you're interested in, please feel free to put it in the questions pod, reach out to Kiera or me, and we can certainly try to accommodate that. But additionally, if you have more questions on that, you can also enter them in the question pod, and we can make sure to follow up with you in the question and answer document. We can get some responses immediately on some of those pressing things if they're kind of outside of my purview. So with that said, that crash course there for you, I'll kind of come back to this actual invoice process itself and going through how to complete this. So making the assumption you know how to classify your expenses and things like that, we're going to kind of move on into this invoicing process itself. Let's say you're kind of coming through here and you have your annual budget and you're putting in different things, right? That's an excessive over budget. So here is where the budget revision process comes into play. So when you guys submit your invoices to ODOT, we are going to immediately look to see if you have any negative budget balances, okay? That's one of the first steps we take, just kind of pulling that curtain back and giving you guys a look into our process here. Because if we see a negative budget balance, we're going to be coming back to you before we proceed to any other steps. Because that means that you have expenses here in this line item that ODOT did not review during that application process. Now, it could be a situation where it's the same exact expenses that you detailed in your narrative. There's nothing that changes in the nature of the expenses. It's just you underestimated them. That's totally fine. That could be the case 9 times out of 10, but it's still us documenting that. It's still us coming to an agreement on that's what's occurring. So even if that is the case, and ODOT saying, yeah, totally, you can claim all those costs. You don't need to revise that $40,000 number to remove any ineligible costs. You still have the issue that your budget is out of balance, and you're still going to have to make this line item whole by taking from another one, okay? So you're still going to have to tell ODOT, so I need to move $10,000 from vehicle operations to from other salaries and wages to my fringe benefits. Okay, and you're just saying it that simply. It's pretty informal. You know, Kiera is going to save that communication. We're going to put it in your project file, but it doesn't need to be the super involved form with all this information and this whole process. We really do care about that bottom line more than this ticky-tack stuff. But again, we want to verify costs are eligible, and then we want to make sure that there's no negative budget balances. So that's just an email again, like I said, to Kiera with, you know, what the additional costs are, and then how you intend to balance your budget. And so I mentioned earlier how these TAN cells are cells that you only have to update once at the beginning of the invoice period process, unless you run into this situation. So once Kiera comes back to you and says, yes, Marcia, I approve that budget change, you're then going to have to actually update your annual budget figures to then reflect that new approved budget from ODOT. You know, that essentially trumps your originally approved budget. So now we want all invoices moving forward to reflect that new approved ODOT budget, because that essentially becomes our new record. So that's an important step to do. So getting the approval is an important step, but you have to take it one step further and then make sure that your invoice itself has been updated to accurately reflect that information. Okay, so, you know, down here, I'm just saying this is a really super program or super small program that's really simple. You just want to pay your drivers their salary and fringe. I'm not going to get too involved in all the other stuff. But you know, you see at the bottom, you have expenses that are $130,000. Okay, your revenues are only 60. Well, that's a bad thing. So you're actually, sorry, I was totally referencing the wrong cell here. Your revenues for Q1, which is what we're looking at, is 40. Your expenses are 60. I should mention, this is important, in the annual budget column itself, you want your revenues at the total revenues to match your total expenses. You want your budgets to balance between revenues and expenses at the beginning. You know, if they don't, then that's a problem. So that's something to check as well. But what we're focusing on here is the quarter. So you have $60,000 in expenses, but only $40,000 in revenue. Okay. So we're going to go into the reconciliation page so I can kind of explain now how your payment is calculated. So before I go into that, I want to take a breath because I'm known to talk a lot and hardly let anybody get a word in. I want to make sure that, people's questions are getting answered. So, Victoria, are there any questions so far?
We just had one come in. It's from Marcia. It says,
Okay.
are there any provisions for the need to track additional costs incurred due to the coronavirus?
Okay. So that's a good question. Okay. So, ODOT put together an FAQ on public transportation and COVID-19. So Kiera is going to be dispersing that information to our 5310 providers today. So you should be getting that update. Within that FAQ, we talk about this, but I'm going to go ahead and take this moment to explain that a little bit more. So FTA on March 13th made an announcement that their emergency relief program would now be expanded to include activities associated with responding to COVID-19. This expansion applies to states where there has been a state of emergency declared. In Ohio, Governor DeWine declared a state of emergency on March 9th, 2020, which now means that programs that are FTA related that are now shifting their focus to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic can now fall under this emergency relief program. Now, there has been some questions with not a lot of answers from FTA on whether or not 5310 falls under that umbrella. In their FAQ, they specifically referenced 5307, which is the Urban Public Transit Program, and 5311, which is the Rural Public Transit Program. They do not mention 5310. However, other guidance references FTA formula programs for which 5310 does apply. And so there is some inconsistent guidance there. And so we're still trying to get clarification on that. But when talking with FTA yesterday, I was told that at this point, because this is a quickly evolving situation, because FTA doesn't want to represent a barrier in people being able to be flexible and adjust to the needs of their community in a timely fashion, they really are leaning on state and local officials to make decisions on how to utilize their transportation services to meet the need. And in Ohio, we have certain counties that do not have any public transit at all. And that's where we're going to be relying on 5310 providers to potentially provide those essential services. And so in Ohio, we have decided that we want to include 5310 providers who receive operating under that umbrella of the emergency relief program. So that is a super long-winded way of me saying, Marcia, if you are someone who is utilizing your 5310 operating grant to respond to the COVID-19 emergency, we are going to allow you to claim those costs under that program. So what does that mean? Under the emergency relief program, when that is enacted, all operating and capital costs are reimbursed at 80% federal instead of 50-50 for operating, for example. So if that's the case for you, then what you need to do is you need to reach out to Kiera and let her know that your agency is directly involved in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we're going to have a separate operating template, we've already created it, that you're going to use to record your cost during the pandemic, which means it starts with March 9th. Everything from January 1st to March 9th must be claimed under this, formula 5310, traditional 50-50 project invoice, okay? So make sure you're recording those costs here. They're not going to fall under that program. But from March 9th on, if you have expenses, we're going to ask you to record them in this invoice that represents that 80-20 split and keeps things separately, so that when this is all settled and FTA comes back and they're asking us for how we responded, we have that separate documentation that we can pull out and give to them that kind of shows what was done. Additionally, there's going to probably be some requirements that come out on ODOT side where we're going to have to modify our federal grants with FTA to represent those projects and costs that were directly related to the emergency relief program. So we want to make sure there is a clear separation for that process as well. So the good news is, Marcia, that invoice template is pretty much the same as this one. So what I'm training you on today, how to complete it, it's going to be the same for that. So you're not going to have that kind of having to get familiar with a new process. We're trying to keep it as seamless as possible for you guys, you know, because we know how busy you are. I mean, you're on the front lines here. We don't want to represent additional time spent on our end with anything we implement. So the biggest distinction for that is where that cutoff point is for your costs. And again, in order for us to classify those costs under this new program, I want you to reach out to Kiera and document how you are responding to COVID-19 and that you feel you fit under this this emergency relief program. And then we can have that in our files to support the decision to loop the 5310 provider in under that, since there's not clear guidance. Yeah.
Macy, Marcia added in that they have a separate pandemic cost center to their chart of accounts to track all the costs clearly, and she said thank you and that she would follow back up with Kiera.
Okay, that's great, and that's a best practice for sure for anyone listening. You know, federal guidance has made it very clear that states cannot dictate to you how to set up your cost accounting system and how you ultimately come up with your cost for your invoice. The only requirement is that it's done on an accrual basis. So, you know, if some of you are working for county governments and they're a cash basis, the onus is on you to convert that to accrual and make sure that's how you're reporting to us. But we're not going to dictate to you that you have to have a separate pandemic cost center. But I mean, that is an excellent best practice that I would encourage for anyone that intends to come in for that funding, because it is subject to audit just the same. And so when we come back in and we say, okay, you claim these costs, show me. It's going to be much easier for you if it is separate. I mean, that's just something to consider for sure. Okay, anything else relative to this portion of the invoice?
There isn't anything else in the question pod.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to go on to this reconciliation tab here and do my best here to explain it. I know it's a lot of stuff. So this entire form is populated and calculated. There is no input fields on your end in this tab itself. This tab is solely taking information from other tabs, okay? So on this tab, again, it pulls in your name, project number, federal share, the report period covered for this specific reconciliation page. So you'll see it pulls in the first quarter report period, not your entire contract performance period. And then it has what is the maximum eligible federal assistance. So this is where you're going to see 50% here because that is the participation rate of FTA for operating costs under normal circumstances, right? So this is why we had to create a separate template for that operating project under the emergency relief program, because everything is going to be calculated differently. And so that's another reason we're going to request that you submit those documents or that information separately too, because it is just a completely different thing there. So what you're going to find on this reconciliation page is ultimately your payment from ODOT, right? So this pulls in your total eligible operating expenses. So you see the $60,000 here. If you recall, at the bottom here on your expenses tab, it shows you, it calculates that the total expenses for the quarter there. So that should match up here. right? And I would love to say that we are immune to formula issues in our templates. We are not. We've had this happen before. So, you know, if something's really weird and it's just not adding up, feel free to reach out to us. We can investigate. Maybe something's happened in your version and all that. So I want to make sure to go through this with you guys so you guys can kind of identify some of those red flags if something's not adding up. I know this has been a point of confusion for a lot of people. So first and foremost, it's going to pull in those total operating expenses. So next, you're going to see fare box revenue and charter service revenue. Okay, so this is federal regulation here. So back on your revenues, for which I did not enter any fare box here. So let's say that you have fares of $5,000. It's going to pull that in, okay? So it is federally required that we determine your net eligible operating by taking your total operating expenses, then subtracting out fare box and subtracting out charter service revenue. And that gives us ultimately your net eligible, which that 50% calculation applies to. So this has been confusing for people in the past. So if they had fares, you know, they were anticipating, oh, I'm going to get $20,000, which before I had those fares in there is what that this cell read. But the second that I put those fares in there, it took that off the top and ultimately changed what you were eligible for. So from FTA's perspective, you know, this is federal assistance, right? So they expect locals to invest in their transit system. And so with that in mind, they're saying, you know, that fare box revenue, that local contribution in that way, you know, we're going to take that off the top. Okay. A lot of people have, you know, taken exception to that. They don't really agree with the mindset, but that is what it is. This is a requirement. And so that's why that happens. That's just something to bear in mind. So charter service revenue, again, this is a revenue function back here. You're not going to run into this in 5310, but I am, just for the sake of it, going to touch on it quickly. So charter service is, you know, for example, if you don't operate on Saturdays, for example, and you have a local fair that wants you to shuttle people from a remote parking lot to the fairground, okay? And this is not open to general public. This is outside of your service area. You're charging them a premium fare, and it's not during your regular hours of service. FTA considers this to be charter. Okay? They're hiring you to essentially perform this charter service. They have a ton of regulations around this because they don't want organizations who are benefiting from public dollars to hinder private business. And so they have put tons of regulations around charter. But the good news for 5310 providers is that there is an exclusion for you, provided that what you're doing is related to the program goals. So in a lot of cases, 5310 providers are doing this all the time. You know, they're shuttling people from senior centers to, you know, an outing somewhere. But the fortunate thing is that trip, that service directly relates to the program goals, which is enhanced mobility for seniors and individuals with disabilities. So pretty much in every case, our 5310 providers fall under that exclusion, and you're not going to have charter revenue. But I want to explain to you that charter process, because if you feel like you are doing something like that and it's not related to seniors or individuals with disabilities, please reach out to Kiara to make sure that you're not doing anything inconsistent with federal requirements. But I think for the most part, you're going to be safe here. And this should most often than not say 0. Okay, so it's going to take, excuse me, your eligible operating costs minus farebox minus charter, and you're going to get your net operating expenses, which now equals $55,000 because I added those fares in to demonstrate. So what this next calculation does is it takes half of what your net eligible is, because that's the reimbursement rate from FTA. So that's going to give us, okay, so your maximum eligibility is $27,500. So this is where your revenues come in, okay? Because remember, your revenues didn't represent an equal 50-50 split. Okay, your revenues were $40,000, instead of 30. So because you have that additional revenue, you're not going to recover that entire maximum eligible federal assistance. So, when you see down here, oh, your payment's going to be $15,000, why am I not getting the 27? Because it's going to capture that, but then it's going to relate that back to your expenses as well. Additionally, it's now going, once we get through that whole process of getting that net eligible and then considering your local revenues, excuse me, which was $5,000. Now the form is going to look at the state and federal that you've received to date. So I mentioned, or I put in my revenues that you had received $40,000 in state operating assistance. And so that's where in this reconciliation it pulls it in. I'm so sorry. And so how this ultimately calculates is your expenses eligible for reimbursement, and then minus all the assistance that you've received to date. That's ultimately how we determine what your payment will be for the quarter. So in this case, in order to make your expenses and your revenues match, you would need to receive $15,000 from your federal 5310 grant to make you whole. And so that is what we are going to put in, or that's what we're going to issue to you, sorry. So then this down here is going to keep track of your contract balance. So if you remember back on our project information tab, we put our contract balance here. Now you'll notice that the operating reconciliation only considers that federal portion of your contract, not your total. Because what we want to know is what is the balance of your federal reimbursement. Because this reconciliation page is going to take that into consideration each quarter, because ultimately it's going to tell this reconciliation form, okay, so you're either going to pay them what they're eligible for, or you're going to pay them their contract balance, whichever is less. So you could come into a situation where you have incurred costs and are eligible for more federal than you have available in your contract. And this reconciliation page is going to tell us to just pay your contract balance, because that's all we have remaining in the project. So that's where this section kind of plays in to this ultimate calculation. So that's some of the stuff that you should be looking for here when this is populating for you. If something seems off, just kind of understanding how this is calculating, so that if you do have a concern, it's founded and you can reach out to us to make sure that you're not getting shorted or overpaid or anything like that. This is significantly condensed from our previous versions. We rolled this out last year, and we did not run into too much confusion or issues. I think the biggest confusion we had was around that fare box revenue, not realizing that was essentially taken off the top. But I think everything else, for the most part, people were pretty understanding of how it was working. So once you have completed every tab of your invoice and everything is accurate to your knowledge, it's looking good, what you're going to do is you are going to sign this reconciliation tab here. So this signature, you're going to have two. You're going to have one for the person who completed the invoice. In some cases, it may be the same person, but we want to know who ultimately completed this invoice. They're going to sign and they're going to date it.
Hey, Macy, I just wanted to mention that you have about 15 minutes left on the
Good,
time that we had scheduled with everybody. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I'm happy to report that I'm actually on time this time. This is rare for me. So next, you're going to get the signature of the authorized official. So this signature must match the name of the individual or the position, if that's what you elected to do, that was identified in the authorizing resolution submitted in your application for this award. So back in the application process, we requested that authorizing resolution, and we verify that the individual named by the governing body is ultimately who is signing these invoices. And if it is not, we will send it back. We won't accept it because that makes us liable at that point, where we only accept correspondence like this, contract signatures, invoices, things like that. We only accept it from the authorized official. So that's important to note, because in some cases that might be some county commissioner who or city administrator who's not involved in your program at all, and now they're signing invoices. So that's just something to consider in that process. So they are also going to date it. Once both signatures have been completed, you're then going to scan it in and you're going to submit it with this Excel document, with the workbook. And we want it in Excel, as it's been completed, because we want to, let's circle back real quick. So now you can see on this project information tab, it tells you what that payment's going to be too. So if you want like a quick, okay, this thing is just horrible and I have no idea, I just want to know what they're giving me, you can go here and it's going to tell you too. So I did mention we would circle back on that. So we want this whole Excel document so that we can really go through, and if we need to look at anything, we have access to it. So we don't want this in a PDF or anything like that, just this signed version of the operating reconciliation. So once you submit the Excel document to us and the signed reconciliation, we will proceed with our invoice review process. And it is an internal ODOT policy that we only have 5 business days to completely turn around a good invoice. So what does it mean to have a good invoice? That means the date of the invoice submission that is ultimately accepted, okay? So if you submit an invoice to us, but we have to send it back because you have a negative budget balance, the clock doesn't start ticking yet. The clock starts ticking once you submit that invoice to us that is ultimately approved. So Kiera only has 5 days to review it, approve it, and send it through our internal ODOT process and get it up to finance for your payment. And so I want to mention that to you guys because I want you to know the turnaround time on this, so that if it's exceeding it, you can reach out to me and let me know, because that's not consistent with our policy. So the process is Kiera reviews it. We do an internal approval with myself and our administrator, Chuck Dyer. And then we submit it to the Division of Finance at ODOT, and they're separate from the Office of Transit. They're that function that ultimately gets that disbursement out to you, verifies everything in the OAK system, runs through that approval process with OVM, does all that, behind the scenes stuff for you. They turn around Transit's invoices in 1 business day. So once they input those payments into OAKS, then it can take a little bit of time to get to you, depending on the method that you have, whether it be electronic funds transfer, which is a little bit more instantaneous, or if you have it set up to be a check. Checks take a little bit longer. But whenever we approve this payment for you, you will receive from us a description of payment, which tells you the date that it was submitted to finance. It tells you what the grant is, the amount that we approved, and all of that. And so you'll get that via email, and then you'll know, okay, I have a payment coming to me. And on that description of payment, we state 10 to 14 business days from that, just to really give ourselves enough time for that process of the transfer of your funds to you. But I kind of wanted to explain that process to you guys so you know what's realistic and what might signify an issue and when to reach out. And so I hope that, through this year, we meet your expectations with that. And everybody's getting their payments in a timely manner. But, you guys have some responsibility in that and making sure that that invoice submitted the first time is accurate and payable. And that's really going to help that turnaround time. So, I hope that this training has been informative for you. I hope it sets you up to be successful so that your first submission is the good submission, and that way we can get your payments done really quickly and keep you guys moving. So that's pretty much the extent of this training. But if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the question pod. It looks like we have about 10 minutes remaining.
And we can still definitely take those questions, as Macy said. I'll be happy to read those off to her. I know Marcia's found the question pod, but if anybody else has questions, please feel free to put them in.
I know some of you, I think Marcia has experience in our submitting our invoices, but if any of you here who do not have experience, have questions, and you don't want to post them here, or you're not, you want to have a conversation offline, please feel free to reach out to Kiera, and we're happy to work with you on this. I do quickly, before we go, want to reiterate the invoice submission due dates to you. So we do quarterly reimbursements through our 5310 program, and our quarters follow the calendar year. So January to April, June to August, September to November, October. Oh my gosh, no, July to October, and then October to December, I think. I usually have it on a map above my desktop, but since I'm working remotely now, I'm relying on my memory. So with each invoice, it is due the 15th of the following month after the quarter ends. So for example, quarter one, which is January to March, the due date would be April 15th. Okay? And then April to June would be July 15th, and so on and so forth. The only exception is for fourth quarter, we have a due date of February 28th instead of January 15th. And this is to allow you to reconcile your books, make sure that everything has been captured, especially because we require you to report your costs on an accrual basis, just making sure everything was converted correctly, that there is no reconciliation that needs to be done. So we allow additional time for your fourth quarter submission. And on top of that, we do require that PCR component, and so we want to give you adequate time to complete that process as well. So that's how the invoice submission will work. Kiera will be solely reviewing and approving invoices. So, if you submit beyond the 15th, and it's significantly late and we are now in the middle of doing applications, just bear with us. Kiera will be carving time out in her schedule during the invoice submission due date to make sure she's meeting that internal ODOT policy of 5 business days. But that really, we're really relying on you guys to also submit those on time so that she can keep up with all of that and the demands of the program. And so if you submit significantly late, Kiara will communicate to you how quickly she can turn it around. But, just be conscious of that we've built processes around these due dates and making sure we can get things done for you guys. So if you guys can submit them on time, that really ensures that we're able to stay on track too.
Okay, Macy. Well, no other questions have come into the chat pod. So
Okay.
I say we go ahead and end the webinar now. And thank you so much for all of the time you have spent explaining everything. I'm sure it's going to be a tremendous benefit to everyone who's on the webinar, for those who watch it in the future. And again, if you have any questions as a participant, please reach out to the Office of Transit directly now, and I'm certain that they will get with you and be able to answer those questions for you. Everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've clicked to end the webinar, but it looks like my laptop is having a few issues here with catching up with us. So,
Okay.
Macy, if you just want to stop sharing your screen and you can mute yourself, and that should take care of things. And as soon as my laptop catches up, the webinar will actually end. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.